Welcome back to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin, talking as always to Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
I'm good, Andrew. It's been like more than 2 weeks since we last talked.
We took a little break. We did, and since then, is the Vistula River frozen? I think it's pretty
Almost.
darn cold where you are.
This morning when I got in the car, it was negative 18 Celsius. I'm starting to think now in Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. I have to now do a little calculation to figure out what it is in Fahrenheit, but it is cold. So,
Hmm.
anyways, this is it's the Vistula I don't think has frozen yet, but it's just about. So we'll see tomorrow.
Okay, well, keep us posted on that. In the meantime, we have a great guest today, someone I am really excited to talk to. I know you are too, Bobby.
Yeah.
I have kind of a mental list in my head of people that I've known over the years through mostly through Twitter that I just have this list in my head of people that I really want to sit down and have a drink with and just really get to know properly in the flesh. And our guest today, Alan Cornett, is really very close to the top of that list. So we are excited to have Alan on the show today and to just shoot the breeze a little bit, not in person, but the next best thing. So, Alan, how are you?
I'm doing well, and if you want to get together for a drink, I am happy to supply the drinks on that. You anytime, either of you, both of you, are welcome to come by, and we'll settle in and talk.
Well, it would
But
have
we
been
can
much
talk
easier.
today.
Yeah, let's talk today. Gosh, as you know, I think, Alan, I used to live in Nashville, and that would have been much, much easier for me to drive up
It
your
would have
way.
been. That's right. That's right. Yeah, you.
Yeah,
We are all a little far afield from one another right now, but you weren't too
indeed.
far down in Music City, USA.
Yes, now I'm down in the Lone Star State. Bobby was here, but now he's over in Poland living the dream of the old world.
Living the
And maybe
dream.
that's
Yeah. The honeymoon is
Yeah,
over, Andrew.
I see a lot of Robert's pictures online, and it's always so beautiful there.
Oh well, yeah. I think yeah, any place I'm just taking pictures, always trying to make my friends jealous back in the States. But it's
Well,
not
it's
all.
working.
I leave out a lot of the pictures of the stuff that like probably 90% of the stuff I probably wouldn't want to post. But you'll see an awful lot of church pictures and cafes, and so I mean Krakow is a perfect city for that. But yeah, Kentucky. I love Kentucky. I mean, I remember when I was a kid going down to like most Chicagoans passing through Kentucky on the way to Disney World.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I remember the hills of Kentucky, and I thought, wow, this is quite a beautiful place with
It
the
it is
horses. Yeah.
very pretty. I live, of course, I'm from Eastern Kentucky, and we've got the whole mountain foothills, pretty scenery there. In and around Lexington, we've got the rolling hills and horse farms, and some of the horse farms are just absolutely gorgeous, just immaculately kept. And so it really is, as far as just sort of natural and I guess not exactly man-made, but man-helped natural beauty. It really is nice. Now we don't have the quite the old world charm of Krakow, but Lexington, as far as American cities not on the East Coast. So after that first wave, Lexington's actually quite an old city for the U.S. It was founded. I mean, it was named Lexington because when the initial settlers came, they heard news of the Battle of Lexington, and so they named the city after
Hmm.
the battle in the town of Lexington. So Lexington, Kentucky, is actually bigger than the original Lexington, but we have buildings that go back into the late 18th century. Not many, but there are some, and so it's as we do the best we can do as far as the new world goes, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Alan, something you said before when you mentioned Bobby's pictures on social media of Krakow and Europe. It made me think about how Bobby said he discarded so many non-picturesque things, and I appreciate that, Bobby, you curate your experience of living over there. And Alan, it seems to me you curate your life quite well also. And I have to
Well,
admit, when I see your posts of your Bluchers or your bourbon tastings and various things like that, I think that's a man who knows how to live. And so I want to get into that a little bit today because one of the things we're interested in our venture here at the Space Salvi Institute is the marks of culture are all around us, and we live in this world of stuff, and so to some degree,
cultural
a lot of this.
debris, we might even say.
Well, you've jumped the gun, but that's precisely where I want to go now. I want you to tell us about your project, Cultural Debris, because that is when I first saw those words together pop up as this podcast and this venture that you've started. I thought that is perfect. I love that. It just sums up so much that I think is important. The idea that we're kind of maybe we're living in the garbage heap, but we're searching for the debris, the stuff that's blown away or been cast off, that we actually think is the important stuff, the beautiful stuff. So tell us about your project, Alan. I think it's really wonderful.
Well, so the name is very flagrantly stolen from Russell Kirk. Who many years ago I had the good fortune of working for as an assistant. But he wrote one of his early essays that he wrote was called Cultural Debris. And it wasn't, I guess I wouldn't say it's a major essay of his, but I always really liked it. And I think that he liked it too, because he included it in the Viking Portable Conservative Reader, which he edited. And the only thing in it of his that he collected was that essay. And I thought, well, clearly he likes that essay too, but it's one that had always stuck with me. And in the essay, he talks about going around Scotland with a wealthy friend of his. Now, Dr. Kirk did his graduate work, his doctoral work at St. Andrews in Scotland. And so, and for many years owned a home in Scotland as well. I don't think it was a large home, but he had a place there. And he spent quite a bit of time in Scotland, and apparently had this wealthy friend, and they would go roaming around. And he talks about that they would go to these Scottish estate auctions, just sort of out in the middle of nowhere, and they would be selling these old leather-bound books. And his friend that he traveled with was a collector of old books in classical languages. He was a classicist, I guess, as a hobby. And so he would buy these old Greek and Latin texts in these old Scottish leather-bound volumes for next to nothing, because nobody wanted them. And Dr. Kirk's friend is really the one who, if memory serves, is the one who said, we live in a time of cultural debris, that we're here trying, just like you were describing, Andrew, we're trying to kind of capture these last remnants of something greater, that we it's like we've stumbled across the pyramid, and we don't know how they built it or what it's for, but we're awestruck by it. And it's it's that conservative impulse, not political conservative, just that conservative, lowercase c, conservative impulse of truly conserving that which is valuable that's gone before. And there's always that sense of sort of longing and nostalgia, for maybe a little bit of an idealized past. People have always been people, and bad things have always happened. Yet at the same time, when we look back, it looks like their best was a lot better than our best, doesn't it? I mean, again, go and look at Robert's pictures. I mean, we're not doing anything like that today, and we can learn from those things. We should, one, try to protect them and save them, and at the same time, I know that this is something you all have in mind with your institute. We want a culture that exists now that can do those things. It's not just simply an antiquarian exercise, but it is better if we can do that too. And we have to have the cultural capacity, I guess, to be able to do that. So anyway, getting back to cultural debris. So I started a podcast late 2020, sort of still in the throes of COVID, I suppose, and we weren't in like extreme lockdown, but they didn't like you to leave, sort of period. And so I started. It was a podcast that I had wanted to do for a long time, and it's one of those things that had been in the back of my mind. I was like, okay, now is the time. If I can't do it now, when will I ever do it? So I started the podcast, and the idea was simply to, well, I tell people sort of the idea of the podcast is to talk to people who I think are interesting that I want to talk to. That's sort of my parameters for it. But cultural debris is broad enough that I can talk to people from all kinds of walks of life. I mean, my first guest was Bradley Berzer, who wrote the biography of Russell Kirk, and we talked about Russell Kirk. But I've had opportunity to talk to a Habsburg. I mean, who would have ever thought that a Habsburg would be on my podcast? That's insane. This past year I spoke to the actor who played the Phantom of the Opera in the final performance on Broadway. Those are sort of insane opportunities to have, but all of those to me fall under that umbrella. We talked about sort of, I guess, expected things like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and those kinds of things. But and I'm working on a upcoming interview with Holly Ordway about her new book on Tolkien. Holly's getting ready to, already is the most frequent guest ever on Cultural Debris. She's getting ready to have her third interview. So Holly keeps writing. And I guess an old Word on Fire compatriot of yours. Her book comes from Word on Fire, and Holly does such interesting work. And like every time she comes out with something, I'm like, Holly, I need to interview you because you keep bringing out these interesting things. But a lot of it is. A lot of the things that appeal to me, just sort of my own personal interests. And so I have to accept that, and other people do too. But the good thing is I found that there really are people who kind of get what I'm doing, and it's grown steadily. And, I'm probably not going to knock Joe Rogan out of his top spot or anything. I keep waiting for Spotify to send an offer, but so far that hasn't happened. But nonetheless, I'll keep plugging along, and I feel like the right people will find me, and so far that's been nice. And then out of that has grown the Cultural Debris excursions, which my friend Tom and I started in 2022. We did our first trips, and the idea there is that we will kind of visit places where we can see up close cultural debris and try to uncover maybe some of, and also go to places maybe that the regular tourist wouldn't go. So our first trip was to Genoa, Italy, and we're going back there this year. And we had two groups who went with us, and we do sort of micro small groups. There are six people maximum in each group, plus Tom and me. So they're very small. The idea was to do the exact opposite of kind of big industrial travel, where you see the dozens and dozens of people following along, getting on a bus and following a guy holding up a little flag and, that sort of thing. But with our group, we're small enough that everybody gets to know each other. We can take public transportation together if we need to go someplace. Ideally, we try to walk as much as we can, but we do little day trips out. And we can go to places that those big groups can't go to. We can go to restaurants where they have, a small table that 8 people can sit around, and you can't take 50 people in there, and you can't have a discussion. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do something different with that, and thankfully we found people who have appreciated that and who get it. Of course, we're looking for more people. We hope to grow, but it's been fun starting this and seeing kind of a tangible outgrowth of it too. So the podcast will continue, And but this is something that I hope will continue to grow out of it too.
That's fascinating. Andrew and I were talking about the name of your podcast a little bit earlier, cultural debris, and we were, the other day I had to talk to my students about the Renaissance. They've been working on the Renaissance for a number of weeks now, and a lot of the students mentioned that it was this encounter with the past, this, if you want to say, with the cultural debris of the Roman Empire in Italy and these journeys and tours of Italy, but also just for the locals rediscovering all of the stuff, the richness that was all around them that helped give birth, to this new culture. And so anyways, it just seems to me, with our project that Andrew and I are trying to work on is to like really help people once again see and also understand those artifacts from the past, not so as to be kind of nostalgic and antiquarian, but for the sake of revitalizing things today, especially, with especially in Krakow here, you have signs of hope, but also you have so much destruction and maybe signs of despair all around you. But that mixture together gives quite an interesting experience. And I've always been, moved by travel and going to, like, I was in Spain for a number of months and sorry, just really encountering, as Andrew called it, the marks of the faith that are still present there, despite its secularism, really helped me. And I brought that back with me to America. But it just seems to me like such a great idea also for kind of laying the groundwork for at least some planting the seeds, at least for something like a new culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, I think. I mean, so Genoa was not a city that I was particularly familiar with. We went there because Tom had spent a lot of time there and knew it well, and so that seemed like a good place to go. It has a very large, it's one of the largest old cities in Europe, intact old cities, and of course there's a lot of history there. It was a tremendous power, but and you see this, of course, in Spain. I'm sure in Krakow too. But you just talk about the churches, and there are these just extraordinary, gorgeous churches, but they're just like little parish churches, right? They're not, I mean, little, but it's not the cathedral. And you may have 3 of those on 3 consecutive city blocks. And these local people dedicated themselves to building that and creating that, and they had this vision of beauty and they had a vision of purpose. And what is it that they had that caused them in many cases to create this structure for their worship over generations? That when they start building this, they know they're not going to finish it. Maybe their grandchildren, maybe their great grandchildren, but I'm sure it didn't occur to them that it wouldn't be finished. They knew it would be. We're going to start this, and it's a project that we as a community are beginning for the next century. And then once that's completed, and of course, in a sense, none of those churches or cathedrals are completed. They're always ongoing. But once it's finished, once it's fully realized, that's something that could last for 1,000 years, not just for these short, not this little short 100-year period, but 10 of those or more. Our culture has no vision like that. We have no level of vision or commitment or comprehension of beauty or longevity on those levels. And to revive culture, we have to regain that. Now, how do you do that? That's the tough part, isn't it? But we know it existed, right? We know that these people had it. And in fact, I think talking about your students, one of the things that it's hard to get people today to understand is that we live in a completely historically analogous time. I mean, it's no other time in history has been like this. We're the anomaly. We're the anomalous time, and people today have the mindset that we ought to be judging these past generations, right? So we're canceling things that don't live up to our standards. But we're the oddballs. That's not to say that we haven't made some progressions in understanding of certain things. Sure, we all recognize that. But to act like everybody prior to 2010 was a Neanderthal or something is to completely miss the point when you can just look at this cathedral. How could people like that? How could people like that be less than we are, right? Obviously they weren't, because look what they've left us. We will leave nothing like that for future generations. Nothing at all.
Yeah, that reminds me, Alan, of, I know you're having worked for Russell Kirk. You think a lot about conservatism. I do too. And what you're saying reminds me that I most identify with this strain that goes from sort of Burke to Chesterton to Kirk to Scruton. Like the idea that, the whole idea of like the democracy of the dead, right? Like why should we be ruled by just the people who happen to be walking around right now, right?
Exactly.
Like we, in a sense, like, right, the past judges us. And that is so difficult for Americans, even ones who are very well educated and well formed, faithful Christian people, even, to kind of really get this sense of like living in continuity. And this is a thing that, when you talk to Americans about, for example, the secularity of Europe, it's true maybe that like in terms of data, in terms of church going attendance numbers, maybe we can point to Europe as being more secular. But this whole marks of faith thing that Bobby mentioned, I took that from Pierre Manon. But that, what that is saying is precisely what you were talking about before, Alan. These people built things that they can't just be easily unbuilt. I mean, they're there. They built the faith so that it's still there, even if, for whatever awful reason, people aren't going to mass anymore or whatever it may be. And this is something that we kind of want to translate back to our countrymen in America. And it seems like your project has a similar character.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, we are fellow travelers, I think, on those issues. It is interesting, and I've had conversations with Europeans who have expressed frustration with the American viewpoint and American I guess lack of understanding of sort of the broader world. And I know that it's tempting to sort of American bash, and I don't want to do that because I think this is where I've lived my entire life, and it's a great place in a whole lot of ways. But when it comes to kind of perspective, whether it be historical perspective, we very much have that sort of that new world mentality of a break with the past, and that's a dangerous thing to have. I think it can lead to bad places. That's why, mentioning Dr. Kirk, he wrote his book Roots of American Order, which was one of his sort of key texts, where he traces the exactly the roots of American order back to Rome and Jerusalem and Athens and London. That the founders, our own founders, understood very much that they were building on a classical past, right? That's why you see portraits of George Washington in togas, because they very much wanted to connect themselves to a past. And so they understood that. But there's been a lot of kind of, I guess, American self-understanding that's not embraced that like it would be helpful. And Robert, you were talking about your students with the Renaissance. I mean, how did the people of the Renaissance understand themselves? So they understood themselves as a renewal and rebirth. They were going back to how they understood the classics. I mean, we now can see there are some things they didn't fully grasp, maybe, that we might know that they didn't. Nonetheless, they did a pretty good job in the Renaissance of creating a culture out of that understanding. And so, one of the things that we have to do is to get people to understand that there is this immense wealth of knowledge and culture, that cultural debris that's there waiting for us to embrace and utilize. We're not starting from scratch. In fact, if we try, we're going to get much worse results, because the great people of the past understood that they were always building on the past, that they were always trying to take that which was good and improve it. That's a very Burkean idea, right? That not that we're going to somehow fossilize things, but that we see, oh, look at this hard-fought wisdom from thousands of years. And so that's why somebody like Marcus Aurelius still speaks to us, right? Because that's wisdom that will always be true, and it will always be valuable, and we can always learn and gain from it. And there's so much of that, but we want to put trigger warnings on anything, pre 21st century. So it's difficult to get people just sort of expand their minds. I mean, we live in a time when people believe they have the most open minds in history, but in fact, they're among the most closed minds in history.
Yeah, Alan, I saw that you've written a lot about Wendell Berry, and also I've seen some pictures of you with Wendell Berry as well. So I assume that you have a good friendship with him. And I discovered Wendell Berry a number of years ago, and it just seems like the kind of the way of life, though, and also his decision to come back to Kentucky and to have a farm and to live in a way that in some kind of live what was handed on to him from his own father and the numerous generations before him is such an example that it just seems today that, and this is not to bash American way of life, because a lot of the things that we're seeing today are so recent. And perhaps maybe you can connect that, do some kind of genealogy to see why it leads to that. But it seems, though, with that agricultural life, that many of the founders stressed as being essential to make this project work. It just lends itself to living in a way that you don't break yourself off from the past. You see all things as gift. You see it as a gift then to hand on to the next generation. Right. And to also to build something that will last, like to focus on the permanent things.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to bring into that, which is, do we see the past as a gift, or do we see the past as a burden? And I think that our generation has primarily chosen to see the past as a burden. And so if it's a burden, then it's something that we need to get rid of. And so you see this wave of tearing down monuments and statues, and all of those kinds of things sort of come out of that mentality, rather than saying, look, we wouldn't have any of the things that we have that we like if it wasn't for the past. Even if I don't understand that I'm living off of this intellectual cultural capital of the past, I still am. And it's what's holding the whole ship together. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes it feels like the ship's coming apart, because we keep pushing away what we need to view as a gift and thinking of it because we think of it as a burden. And that's a real challenge. That, of course, ties into the understanding that certainly there are problems in the past, but we will always have problems. That doesn't mean that we just say, oh, well, that happened then, so that means it was A-okay. No, we can assess and say, okay, well, yeah, we can see how people of the past did things that we today would have real problems with. Okay, sure. But we also need to have the perspective that people in the future are going to say that about us. What were they thinking doing what they were doing? And there's very little sort of self-evaluation when it comes to that, I think. But talking about Wendell Berry, I mean, I have been very, speaking of a gift, I'm very grateful for the gift of being able to know him. I was talking with a friend recently because I'm actually speaking on Wendell Berry at a conference in Kansas next month in February, and I'm going to talk about sort of do an introductory survey of Wendell Berry to a group of people, and maybe tell some anecdotes, that sort of thing. But Berry is, in some ways, kind of the last man standing of that old Jeffersonian tradition. And now we're starting to see some revival of that in some ways, sort of like the doomer optimists groups and those sorts of things. I think they're trying to implement some of those ideas, but Berry has been the torchbearer of a strain of thought that goes back to Jefferson and goes back to the founders. And of course, Jefferson's ideal was, even at the time, was countered by the Hamiltonian vision. And it looked like Jefferson won. I mean, you look at all the different Virginia planter presidents that we had, and the old Hamiltonian Federalist Party literally ceased to exist. But as Eliot would say, there's no such thing as a lost cause because there's no such thing as a gained cause. Hamiltonianism really roared back through, people like Henry Clay, my fellow Lexington resident, going back. The Henry Clay home is here in Lexington, Ashland. You can visit it; it's lovely. But Clay brought in the American system and sort of revived those kind of Hamiltonian vision that really was carried forth by Lincoln and the early Republicans. And it became the dominant mindset of modern America. And that's a real shift from the way people like Washington, certainly Jefferson, Madison, thought about the Republic and what it was supposed to be. And so Berry has really been somebody who's lived that out in the best way that he can. And he is the first to say, I've not lived perfectly, and there's no such thing, of course, as a perfect life, right? We're all in a fallen world, which is crucial to understanding any of this, is that we can't have the utopian perfectionism that the left thinks we have to have. That doesn't mean we don't try to do better, but we also understand that, the fall we will always have with us until the return. So that's just the way it is. But Berry has carried that forward and has also, I think, in some ways, reinterpreted it for the modern times. But there is, of course, an element of that to the modern ear that's always going to seem anachronistic, right? So I think a lot of people dismiss Berry because he has this pastoral vision. And Wendell's not telling everybody to become a farmer. I mean, he says we need cities, we need city people. Not everybody is supposed to move to Henry County, Kentucky, and live beside the Kentucky River. He would probably be upset if they tried to do that because he's not going to want that many neighbors, right? But it's okay for people to live in cities. But the thing that we have to learn is that America is different without a vibrant rural people and without farmers. We're seeing right now protests from German farmers. We saw earlier last year protests from Dutch farmers, particularly. Now the German farmers are protesting. And they are themselves, they recognize that it's not, agriculture isn't an American idea, because all of those, Jefferson and others were appealing back to, I have a cat here in front of me, so pardon the cat invasion, but they're looking back to, with Washington, somebody like Cincinnatus. What did Cincinnatus do? Cincinnatus walked away from the plow, won the war, and went back to the plow, right? That's the foundational American myth, and people today don't even grasp what that's talking about, and we're just very disconnected from that. But somebody, Barry kind of lived that out himself. He was a writing instructor at NYU very early in his career, and could have settled into New York society, and kind of been a Southern Kentucky mascot, and at the cocktail parties and all of that. And from a marketing standpoint, that would have been a great leverage point, right? You could be the toast of the town. But he walked away from all of that to come back. He taught at UK, University of Kentucky, which I live very close to. Moved back to his farm. Eventually gave up teaching at UK full time and wrote. Of course, he was in a position where he was able to do that because of his writing and so forth. But still, he walked away from something that most people would think you're insane to walk away from. And I think that for him was something that he personally, to be authentically himself, had to do. But it, on the one hand, has undermined his ability to be as well known as he would have been. I think you stay in New York and you have that kind of literary presence and talent like he had, and productive output like he has. He would have certainly been much more well known than he is. But his writing would have been different, and it wouldn't have had the power that it has now, because it's fueled now by an authenticity, which I know is a word that's abused these days, right? Because we have kind of packaged authenticity, but I think Wendell, by doing what he did, he gives power to what he says, in a way similar to Washington, who gave power to what he did by walking away from it, by being willing to walk away. And there's the story of King George III, when they tell George III that Washington has resigned his commission as general and has returned to Mount Vernon and given up power. And George III said, if he does that, he's the greatest man alive in the world. And he probably was, because he genuinely did that. But somebody like George III, who the idea of giving up power would have been inconceivable to him, nonetheless, he could see the power of doing it, right? So that's something, that's sort of Tolkien-esque, right? You've got the ring, but are you willing to give it up? And it's hard to do. But in order to really to go back to Hobbiton, you've got to do it, right? If you want to be in the Shire, you can't have the ring. And you've got to be willing to let it go. And so that's there are lots of overlaps of themes from these different places, I think. Not an accident when we're talking about Western civilization.
Yeah, it's all connected. And it's interesting that you bring up Tolkien. To me, we brought up the word nostalgia a little while earlier, and that is, to most people, a negative word. To me, it is not a negative word. I think it's a very positive word. I think it's etymologically, it's a longing for home, right? And so when I think of someone like Tolkien or Wendell Berry, so Wendell Berry went home, but also he created home. He created from his stories like a connection to a place that didn't actually exist, but we want to imagine, right. but has like a texture to it and a reality and these characters and the land and all that sort of thing. And the reason that I love that is that, there was a little while ago, there was this song, some big country song. I don't really listen to contemporary country music, but there was this song, Try That in a Small Town. And it was supposed to be like, if you have certain values or do certain things, like, you can't do that in, small town America. And a number of commentators said, and I thought this was apt, they said, well, yeah, the problem with that is go to most small towns in America. They're pretty sad places, actually.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
they're full of now, sadly, like opioid addicts and, poverty and, all the things that used to be there aren't there. The farmers that are there just are kind of cogs in this big ag machine. They're not really like Wendell Berry, right, on his family farm or whatever. So, but to come back to the nostalgia thing, the reason that I like the nostalgic view is to say, um, there there was something, but even if there wasn't, we have this sort of innate understanding of this idea of home, of like what our home should be and like what our culture should be, like in the etymological sense, like what our society should be sort of like worshiping and kind of organizing itself around. So that's one of the reasons I love Wendell Berry, and I love, but for me, myself personally, I made my peace with this at some point that, yeah, I'm a city guy, and there would be no point in me trying to like live the Wendell Berry dream. But I hope some
Well,
people do,
but I mean, I think that's realistic, though. I mean, I don't live on a farm either. I grew up on a farm in Eastern Kentucky, but even at the time, everybody in my family were teachers. So my father was an elementary school principal. My grandfather taught math and physics at the high school for 40 years nearly. My mom taught second grade. Everybody, I mean, literally everybody, aunts, uncles, cousins in my family were teachers. That's just sort of what the family did. Nonetheless, we lived on a farm, and but that wasn't the source of our income because my parents taught, and obviously with my dad being a principal, it wasn't being out plowing the field wasn't something he could do with regularity. We had a garden, and back then, tobacco was still a big crop, and so you could lease out your farm, and people would grow tobacco on it, and so that's usually what happened on our farm. So other people came in and they would grow tobacco, but it was still active. I mean, agriculture was an active thing when I was growing up, and we for at least a period of the time when I was growing up, we did have cattle, and I looked out my house window to the backyard, and there were cows there. That was just what I saw. That was normal. We were very disconnected from that. I was not, it would be wrong of me to represent myself as a, sort of hard-edged farm boy. I was like, on the academic team. That's what in high school, that's what I did. But I was around it and I was involved in it to some degree. I wasn't disconnected from it. Maybe I should put it that way. So what we've lost is not just a connection with the countryside and food production. People don't know where food really comes from. That's a practical problem. But it's also the case that we don't appreciate what was always understood and just assumed for millennia, which was the value culturally of agriculture and farming. Doesn't mean everybody has to be involved in it, but there was a reverence for it, right? Everybody, the farmer might be kind of made fun of by the sophisticated and so forth, but there was a nobility kind of in that landed gentry, especially, but also the yeoman farmer was something that was very much embraced in the Jeffersonian ideal. And so Berry has written a lot about the connection of agriculture and culture. And in fact, some of his essays or books of essays would be subtitled something like Essays on Culture and Agriculture or something like that. He's making an explicit connection there that most people don't see. I mean, it's built into the word, right? Agriculture, but most people don't think about it that way. And instead, we sort of excise that and we turn it into agribusiness. But if you try to run a society on business instead of culture, then you get what we've got right now, right? That it's not good. But Berry's not coming up with a connection that nobody ever thought of before. He's trying to reintroduce us into a connection that everybody always assumed. Again, going back to the ancients, you go back to ancient Greeks, the Romans especially revered the idea of that agricultural person. and that they were pure of heart and pure of motive. And yeah, I mean, we understand that there is a certain that there's an idealizing of that, sure, but that's what myths do. But that doesn't mean they're not important. And we have to keep that connection, and that's what the people even we see right now in Germany are fighting for. That's what they're, even if they don't think of it on quite those terms. I mean, they're like, hey, I'm out here making your food and you're trying to put me out of business. There are consequences to that. There are cultural consequences to when a country does that, and only a country that is in bad shape tries to do that to their farmers.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been doing it in America for 150 years. We aren't quite to the level of some of the EU countries on doing it, but it's going to get worse. I mean, we're seeing things like that in Canada, certainly, I think. And so it's worthwhile. I mean, it's worthwhile for culture, for society at large, to have a reverence for those who produce their food.
Mm-hmm.
And because otherwise we can't live. We don't want, we don't want to live in the pod. We don't want to eat the bugs, right? That's right. We want something real. We want a connection to the actual soil. Even today we've got the expression touch grass, right? So people intuitively know we need a connection to a reality. All of us have the good fortune of talking to one another on these far-flung places through a virtual realm. I'm glad that we have that. I mean, none of us would be able to do a podcast without it, right? Or it would be hard. But at the same time, we can't live in this world. We have to live in a real world, and the realer the world, the better it is, because it forces us to face. It gets us out of the abstract, and that's one of the keys of Barry's writing as well as Russell Kirk's writing. Is both of them have a hatred for, like this sort of visceral hatred for the abstract versus the real, versus the solid. Anytime we get into the abstract, you're getting into trouble. I mean, Barry has written, and he has said to me, of course, abstraction is the enemy. I mean, that he puts it in very blunt terms. Abstraction is the enemy, and Dr. Kirk felt exactly the same way, and that's why he had such a hatred for ideology, because ideology is per se abstract, because it doesn't deal with reality. It doesn't deal with the reality of human nature and the reality of the fall. So that's all of these writers pull us into that, and that's why the reverence for the soil is important, because it forces us to look to something real and solid. You can go get a handful of soil, and you can understand the visceral physical importance of that.
As somebody I follow an awful lot is Matthew B. Crawford, and you said getting in touch with the reality. His book is The World Beyond Your Head. It seems, and you just kind of nailed it on the head there. The enemy is abstraction. He just had a new post on when you go to the car mechanic, and now you have somebody who comes, instead of talking to the actual mechanic, you have somebody who works at the desk, who comes to you with this chart, who doesn't understand the cars, and you can't talk to the mechanic. It's another level of separation. And it just seems to me, even today, you look at these futuresque kind of depictions of what farming will be like, with people with their tablets, kind of looking at the plant instead of smelling the soil, touching it, looking, actually being really, really connected to reality. It just seems that not to be like a Luddite I'm very grateful for the blessings of technology. The minute you say anything negative about it, everybody just freaks out. But it seems that but what's really happening though is that abstraction from things, where you're going to then end up like not necessarily, but going towards the Wall-E world where we're
Right.
all just surrounded by the screen and we're not connected to reality at all. So that's a really good way of putting it.
Do you remember a few years ago? I mean, it wasn't that long ago, when I think he was still mayor. Bloomberg was mayor in New York, and he gave some speech where he talked about he was talking about the complexities of something in the modern business, modern world. And he said, it's not like farming. I mean, with farming, you could just give you some seeds, you go put them in the ground, and it's going to grow a plant. And he was just completely dismissive of any kind of knowledge or skill that would be required to grow plants in order to feed him. And that's because somebody as powerful and as wealthy as he is completely disconnected from the reality of that. I mean, no one who has any knowledge of farming at all. This is why it's valuable for people to grow a garden or have a couple of tomato plants, which is something Wendell Berry always recommends. He says it's always good, even if you're in the city, grow something. Put a tomato plant in a pot, because you will be humbled very quickly with dealing with those things, because you think, why is this not working? I'm doing everything right. Well, obviously you're not, or it would work. But it teaches us that we can't always force our will on things. There are things outside of our control, and that it forces us to spend time and effort to learn the particularities of things. And so the particularity of this tomato plant on your back deck is different than the particularities of my tomato plant on my back deck or my patio or my backyard. And a farmer has to figure that out. It forces particularity. In other words, it rejects the abstract. I can't not be particular about it because I'm trying to grow this tomato plant. I'm not worried about tomato plants in the abstract. How does one grow a tomato plant? I'm trying to grow this one, and it's not working. What am I doing wrong? What's the problem here? Is it not in the right place? Is it not? Am I watering it too much? Is the soil wrong? All of those things. But to somebody like Bloomberg, and I'm picking him because he put himself out there on it. Most everybody are idiots about this, but not just him. But it was something just very dismissive about, well, this is something that farmers do. And it had this notion that farming was easy, it was easily replicated, sort of drone-like people did it. When in fact, the reality is that's the people who often work in office jobs, sort of the office drones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not a farm, not a real farmer, because they're working real land in a real place, growing real crops. And so one of the things that farming does in a cultural way is that it does tie us to particularity. And this has been, we can flip that and say, okay, what's been one of the big problems of American foreign policy over the past 100 years? It is that we have attempted to force abstraction, usually that we've drawn from our own constitution or our own political history, force abstraction on completely different foreign countries that have no tradition matching ours. So you can't just photocopy the U.S. Constitution and hand it to Iraq and say, do this. It doesn't work because it's a completely different particularity than we are. Those are different people. And so that's been, been the cause of a lot of damage in the world, and who knows how many lives lost over the past century because of that kind of abstract thinking that we can just do these things and it will work. And we keep being slapped in the face that it doesn't work. Afghanistan most recently, where you would think we would have been humbled. But one of the things, Americans are very resilient about not being humbled on those things. So we keep not being, I think. So anyway.
Yeah, Alan, the rejection of abstraction, or even just contemplating that issue of abstraction or the abstract versus the real, was really mind-blowing for me frankly when I first started reading Kirk and Scruton and people like that. And I have to say that way of thinking led me ultimately is one of the major things that led me to become Catholic, actually,
Yeah, absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
the whole and especially once I encountered Ratzinger and like basically the kind of the the much maligned Vatican II theology or whatever, but the idea that the Catholic Church isn't just the biggest and best denomination. The Catholic Church isn't just sort of like doesn't just have this rule book that says, hey, this is a pretty good idea and it's old, so we'll just kind of stick with that. No, I mean the Catholic Church is proposing itself as the real. It is specifically saying we're not. This is not abstract at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
just Ratzinger is very good on that. I mean, he's all the time, saying that the more we face reality, true reality, um, the closer we're getting to understanding God. And that's one of the reasons why I don't want to get like, and you all probably don't either want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but it's one of the reasons why you see such a difference in thinking from especially sort of evangelical Protestantism and Catholicism is a lot of the things a lot of the things of Catholicism, a lot of the practices, the relics, a lot of these, just real solid actual things. I mean, I was in Bologna and saw the upright seated body of Saint Catherine of Bologna that's been there for hundreds of years. There she was in her nun's habit, looking back. Those things shock the mind of a lot of moderns, also a lot of evangelicals, but it ultimately, I think, comes down to the embodied versus the disembodied, which is another way of saying the real versus the abstract. And a lot of Christian theology, and sometimes even among some Catholics, trends towards the disembodied. And anytime it does, problems happen because it's abstraction. It's not reality. It's not the physical. And so you see a lot of discussion of soul versus body, rather than understanding the holistic a holistic understanding of the creation of body and soul. And that was something I was raised in, and it takes a bit of a mental leap to kind of get there, but it is reality, and it's the age old way of understanding things. But the further we get away from the hard and solid and real, the worse things are going to get. Whatever it is.
yeah, well said. Anything else, Bobby, for Alan? What a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, no, it's amazing too how a lot of those, not everyone, but many of those thinkers who are trying to think through the abstraction to the reality end up oftentimes becoming Catholic. So it's that kind of that sacramental sense too, that it just you want to be close to the holy, but the holy as embodied. Right here in Krakow, I think I've mentioned this before, and I'll finish with this, but in the Dominican Priory, there's a number of there's a saint, Saint Hyacinth is buried there, but there's another person who's right after he died. I forget his name. He was believed to be a saint, and they were telling me that some of the Dominicans there were telling me that they've discovered that all these people were buried right next to him. Like all these people in Krakow just wanted to like be as close as possible to his relics. Um, and it's just to me that is that sensibility.
Right. Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah, and we often see that sort of thing characterized as superstition, right? Sort of dismissed as superstition. And I'm not saying that superstition doesn't exist or can't exist and that we shouldn't be wary of it. But that may just be people thinking in solid, real terms, right? And I think that that's fundamentally what it is. And that kind of thinking is very much a modern way of thinking, and it's a dangerous way of thinking. And to the degree that we are going to revive, circling back to the beginning, to revive culture, to recognize the value of this cultural debris of the past in order to revive culture to where those aren't just past things, but they're real living things that we're making and doing. We have to become more and more comfortable with the real and the visceral, and the more we embrace the hardness and physicality of reality, then the more likely those things are going to happen. And we're fighting against technology to some degree. Like you said, I mean, we're not saying technology per se is bad, but it presents challenges that we have to be cognizant of. We can't just be dismissive of it or accept it completely on its own terms, just because, I guess from that, the great philosophical series on Jurassic Park, where, right, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, right? There's a lot of truth to that. And, we're seeing that with AI. I see all sorts of wonderful uses for AI in computers being able to analyze ancient documents and doing translations of cuneiform tablets, and all sorts of things that would require more manpower than we ever could possibly have. At the same time, we see where AI is creating artistic creations where culture is not going to be rebuilt on the art of AI. It's going to be built on the art of actual people who are having creative ideas and are skilled at implementing them, and are drawing from the past but being imaginative, using what Kirk called the moral imagination to bring about something good and positive and new. And that's what we have to have, and not be stuck in the past, but not reject the past either, but embrace it and do great things with it. That's what the Renaissance did. That's what the founders did. We've lost touch with that.
Don't believe the AI hype, Alan. Those cuneiform translating bots want to kill you. Don't believe it.
It's entirely possible. I mean, I may be killed by a cuneiform bot at some point.
Well, what a tremendous conversation. I just recommend everybody, yes, go touch dirt, go feel some tweed on a jacket, go fill a glass full of something intoxicating and intoxicate it, as Scruton would say. Go live in reality. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
All right. Well, on that note, Alan Cornett, thank you so much for joining us today. Everybody, please.
I've enjoyed it.
Well, we have really enjoyed it, and we definitely want to point our listeners, if, as you said, Alan, we're fellow travelers. We probably have a lot of audience overlap, but we would love it if anybody who hasn't checked out your Cultural Debris podcast to go and do so. And also, hey, maybe take a trip with Alan.
That could be absolutely fun. Take a trip with us.
Yeah.
They should. Yeah.
All right. To all of our listeners, if you enjoyed this, please do like, share it, subscribe, give us a good review so that we can continue to give you the content that you want. As Alan said before, we're not looking to compete with Joe Rogan exactly, but we do think we have something valuable that is a niche in the market that we do hope we can kind of push open even a little bit more. So we love to continue to make these shows. So please do join us next time on the Space Salvi Institute podcast. Until then, live in hope and God bless.